Can the people who've joined so far hear me? Please comment if you can. Great. I'm just going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes for anyone else to join, and then we'll get started. Right, okay, I'm going to make a start. So if you have any questions at any point, please do just feel free to comment in the chat box on the right. I'll most probably just make my way through all the slides and then answer the questions at the end. It shouldn't take too long at all, probably about half an hour in total, and I'll leave plenty of time at the end in case you want to ask any more specific questions. So first of all, just a little bit about Make a Medic in case this is the first time you've come to one of our events. We are a registered charity that was started about 3 years ago. We are run by junior doctors and medical students, all of whom are volunteers. And what we do is we produce med-ed courses only for medical students at the moment, but we're actually planning on expanding into the postgrad space in the near future. So please do make sure you follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter because some of this stuff may be quite useful to you in the future. So we market these courses at affordable prices, and the revenue that we generate, we put it towards projects abroad. So most of them, in fact all of them, are focused on public health or med-ed initiatives. So you've got examples of the ones that we've completed on the left-hand side there, and we've got a few that we're hoping to complete in 2023, which we'll no doubt be posting about on social media. We're also in the early stages of developing our widening participation branch. So given that we've got a background in developing courses of a high quality, we wanted to start applying this to widening participation initiatives as well. So I'm sure most of you are aware that there are plenty of courses which cost in excess of £500 just for students to feel a bit more secure about the UK CAT and interview and things like that. And we personally think that that's kind of outrageous to be charging such exorbitant fees for something that shouldn't really act as a barrier for students trying to get into medicine. So we are planning on making high quality courses which match some of the private ones, and making them freely available for whoever wants them. Right, so just a little bit about me. I'm the founder of Make a Medic. I'm currently doing my F3, and I personally could not recommend it anymore. It's been the best year of my life, and I'm going to go through what I've done this year sort of as a case study. If you have any questions after this point about F3 or developing your portfolio or literally anything, please feel free to add me on LinkedIn or email me through that email address shown on screen. So first and foremost, why do people do an F3? So I'm sure many of you, if you're here, it's already a bit of a selection pressure. I'm sure all of you are considering doing an F3. Maybe you've decided you definitely are going to do an F3, or maybe you're on the fence. Either way, here are some of the common reasons why people might do an F3. It might be a case of you having a bit of an existential crisis. Perhaps F1, F2 wasn't quite what you expected it to be, and you need to have a little bit of a breather and figure out what you actually want out of life. I know that sounds pretty deep, but in reality, we do all have those moments at certain junctions in our life, and that's completely fine. You might have applied for something this year and not necessarily got the outcome that you were hoping for, which is, again, not a problem whatsoever. I know that sometimes it may feel like you need to be constantly on this medical treadmill, but in reality, you can step off, see some wonderful places, enjoy yourself, and then get back on whenever you want to. Sorry about those. 1 second, let me just. There you go. Probably won't hear the mail alerts anymore. So I wouldn't worry too much if it's anything to do with training programs and you feel like you haven't got what you wanted. It's only 1 year in what's likely to be a near on 50-year career, so it really doesn't make much of a difference. Take an F3, take an F4, do whatever you want and take your time, because there's no rush at all. Some of you may be thinking, you know what, I do want to go into training, but in fact I just want a bit of a break. So that's my line of thinking. So I didn't apply for any training programs last year because I knew that whilst I'm in my mid-20s, I want to enjoy myself and travel around and do some interesting things. Again, sort of what I was getting at is that many people do use F3 as an opportunity to travel, and that really is something that is pretty special, because it's one of those things that you can always put off. You can think, you know what, I'm going to do it when I'm 35 after I'm a consultant, but in reality, life can catch up with you. There may be different commitments and things to pin you down to a certain place. So if you have the means and the opportunity, it's something to consider if you are interested in it. And finally, some of you may be thinking, you know what, I've got some interests outside medicine, and I want to see. Explore them a little bit, spend a bit of time working in some other department or networking or whatever, just to figure out if that may be more appropriate for me. So either way, whatever your reason, an F3 is an amazing opportunity. And not to get too sort of cheesy about it, but the purpose of F3 is for you to focus on yourself, because thus far you've sort of been doing things on other people's terms. And what I mean by that is you've had exams that are set in front of you that you have to get through, then you're working on a rota which is set for you and a training program which you have to get through, and all of that is of course you chose it, but it's still kind of dictated by someone else. Whereas F3 is a chance for you to take control and do something you really want to do. And I've kind of split this up into 3 domains. In reality, it's kind of 2. One of them is travel and personal things. So you might think, you know what, I want a year out just to, go to Fiji, go traveling, see Southeast Asia. That's completely fine. Do it. You may as well if you have the means. It may be for certain other personal developmental reasons as well. So you might want to develop some skills outside medicine and take a little bit of time to just work on yourself. Again, perfectly good reason to do an F3. Then the second 2 are kind of similar. I'm not entirely sure why I put them as 2 different ones, to be totally honest. Some of it may be, I can remember actually. So some of them may be work related, meaning that you might be thinking, okay, where do I want my career to go? Does it need to be medicine? Can it be something else? Maybe I'll take a year out and apply for an internship with management consulting, or do something to do with the law or whatever. You may be thinking, you know what, I want to rebrand myself and do something slightly different, but before I call it quits entirely, I just want to have a taste and gather a bit more information. So that's what I would describe as work-related things that you can work on whilst you're on your F3. And finally, portfolio as well. So if you are planning on returning to medicine, then you may be thinking, okay, I need to tick a few things off my portfolio. Because famously, portfolio things are one of those issues amongst medics where it's usually a bit too late once you realize you have a problem, if that makes sense. So some of you, if you've applied this year, you may have got to the stage where you're thinking of applying and you've opened up the whole pre-assessment forms or the marking rubric or whatever, and you've seen that there's all sorts of things that you haven't had a chance to do. So this is a good opportunity to plan ahead and identify a few key portfolio areas that you'd like to tick off at a steady pace during your F3 year, so that you're best prepared for the next application cycle or in F4, whenever you plan on doing it. So if that applies to you, I really would strongly recommend subscribing to our monthly newsletter, because we have plenty of opportunities coming out, as well as a lot of free events looking at portfolio specifically. Because one thing I'd like to do for the current F1s and F2s is to give you guys a bit of a heads up, because like I said, it's one of those things that's often that you're often made aware of a little bit too late. So giving you a heads up and giving you some time to plan things, I think is really important. Right, so now we'll move on to how you can actually do an F3, and I've broadly categorized this into two groups. So there's the fixed approach and the variable approach. So the fixed approach refers to jobs or ways of working that involve some sort of contract where you're going to be doing something for a relatively long time. So that includes clinical research and teaching fellows and long-term locum contracts. The alternative is a variable approach, where you're essentially just doing sporadic locums whenever you feel like it or whenever they're available. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So one of the examples of a fixed version of doing an F3 is being a clinical fellow, and I'd say this is probably the most common option. So a fellow or a junior clinical fellow essentially is an SHO who's got a contract for 6 months or 12 months and is working at a trust grade level. So they aren't progressing in any way. It doesn't mean that you're going to be moving up the sort of medical ladder. You're just operating at that level in a specific job, and you're getting paid on a monthly basis just like you would have been as an F2. The way that you can find these jobs, it's actually pretty easy. There's a website called NHS Jobs that some of you may have looked through before. It's fairly user-friendly. You can set your location, you can set your specifications, and then check it regularly to see when jobs arise. One thing I'd also recommend doing is that you can set some email alerts. So essentially saying, I'm interested in doing these types of jobs in this area. Please send me an email if they were to come up. And you can apply through NHS Jobs. There's sort of like an online portal where you answer some questions about yourself. And there's sort of personal statement type questions as well. And often they'll take you through to an interview, after which they offer you the job. So these jobs appear at various different stages. So some of them, for example, this year, quite a few of them are already live, but many of them will probably go live in around April time, which is around the time that people who've applied for specialty training find out whether they've got what they wanted or not. So I'd say April is a really good time to keep an eye on this if you're planning on doing a clinical fellow job. So in terms of the good and bad of being a clinical fellow, I'd say the good thing is that it gives you an opportunity to properly try out a new specialty. So some of you may have done taster days before, but in reality, it's a bit hard to get much out of a taster day, especially if you're doing something that's a little bit, out of left field, like ITU, where it takes a bit of time to get to grips with things. So quite often people do a clinical fellow job because they have some interest in a specialty which they actually haven't had much chance to explore in the past. So that's a really good reason to do it. And when you come to interview, quite often, I think pretty much every single specialty will award points for commitment to specialty, as they call it. So that's evidence that you've gone out of your way to try and explore the specialty in question in more detail. The other good thing is that it's steady and predictable income, so you'll know that for the next 6 months you're going to be paid this amount of money. For some people who are international medical graduates, who may be here on a visa, it can be a requirement to have a contract, so that's another thing to consider. And break in service is something I don't know a huge amount about, to be totally honest, but there is some sort of NHS scheme where if you are working continuously for the NHS over a longer period of time, it can affect things like maternity leave and sick leave and things like that. But please do look that up in your own time, because I don't understand it totally myself. As for the downside, I'd say the biggest downside is that many people get to the end of 2 years and they're like, okay, you know what? enough of this rota lifestyle. I don't really want to be in hospital for 40 to 60 hours a week. So that's one fairly big factor. You can get some fellow jobs which are less than full time. So they'll advertise it as either a 70% job or a 50% job, or it might be 70% clinical, 30% teaching. There's all kinds of weird cocktails of fellow jobs that you can look into. So you do have the option of working less than full time, and even if you apply for a full time role, you may be able to negotiate with them as well. The other thing to bear in mind is, what if you really don't like it? And the counter argument, fairly simple counter argument, is that you could just, call it quits and give your notice. And how quickly you can do that will probably vary depending on the rota. But I'd say those are the two main cons. I'd say the biggest is that rota factor. Right, so moving on to research fellows. So I know a handful of people who've done this. It's essentially a contracted job where you are doing a dedicated research post. So there aren't very many such jobs available. You can get some of them through NHS Jobs, but another good way of looking into it is by just emailing any contacts that you may have had from F1 and F2, especially those that work at university hospitals. So that's probably a better way of going about it, really, where you can identify people who are doing research that you're interested in, and you can explain that you've got this year where you'd like to explore research further, you've got this and that skill, and you'd like to apply it in some sort of research context. So that might be a good way of actually creating a fairly bespoke research fellow job for yourself. So some of them are available through NHS Jobs. Also check out the university pages as well. So for example, Imperial College has some research fellow type jobs that you can apply for. So essentially, long story short, NHS Jobs, emailing people you know, and also the university website. The good thing is that you may be able to get some research outputs from it, but make sure you kind of manage your expectations, because research outputs can take quite a lot of time. So for example, even if you do it for the first 6 months of your F3 year, it may not be published until midway through the following year, in which case it's not necessarily that applicable for the following training cycle. So that's one thing to bear in mind, though you can still, of course, talk about it at interview. Having some experience in academia is certainly useful if it's something you want to pursue further in the future when it comes to applying for masters and PhDs and things like that. And quite often, I suppose it's project dependent, but quite often you have quite a lot of free time as well, or work from home time, meaning that it's a little bit more relaxed than being on a full-time rota the entire time. The downside is that it definitely is heavily dependent on the supervisor and the project, and quite often it's difficult to know how good it will be until after you're enmeshed in it. So that's one thing to consider. And sometimes it can just drag on. So you might, do your paid research during the 6 months that you're there, but then quite often there'll be sort of remnants of that project that continue well into whatever your next job or whatever your next doing is. So that's another point to consider. And third is teaching fellow. So teaching fellow means that you are contracted by either a hospital or a university to deliver teaching to the students. And this you can again find through NHS Jobs, but it's actually probably more likely that you'll find it advertised on the university websites. So if you're considering this, I'd recommend thinking about, where do you want to live? So if you think, okay, I want to live in West London, and then find the university that's based there. So Imperial hires teaching fellows every year, and those jobs are meant to be pretty good. So you can find ways of applying for these jobs just through the university websites. So the good thing is that you can essentially get all of your teaching stuff sorted, and it differs from research in the sense that it's kind of more under your control. So research stuff has a lot of external factors involved, like ethics and working with other people and getting things reviewed, etc. Whereas teaching things are a little bit easier to execute because the students are often quite used to giving feedback and taking part in things like quips and audits. So you would be able to get a pretty decent amount of stuff done in 6 months as a teaching fellow. It's a really good work schedule as well, very much 9 to 5. Several days of the week you may not really need to have any, you may not have any reason to go into the office if there's no sort of face-to-face teaching. You may even be able to do remote teaching, and you also have the university holidays as well, which is a real bonus. The downside is, again, this is based on relatively little data on my part, but I've heard that the pay isn't great because it's a 9 to 5 job. But I mean, you can always supplement that with by doing locums and things like that as well. But yeah, teaching fellow is another good route if you need to bolster your teaching points in your portfolio. Right, and the final option is to be a long-term locum. So this is if you aren't so fussed about the portfolio side of things and you just want to try and make a reasonable amount of money relatively quickly. So maybe you want to do it for 3, 4, 6 months and then use that money to go traveling or do something else. So long-term locum means that you have a fixed locum contract at some sort of NHS trust. And the way that you find these is mainly by going through locum agencies. Actually, I think it's only by going through locum agencies. And this event is sponsored by a locum agency called Holt Doctors, who I've had a meeting with, and they are incredibly dedicated to putting you at the center of the process, really, because they appreciate that locum agencies sometimes have a bad reputation of harassing the doctors who have registered with them. But Holt Doctors are quite different from what I've seen of them. They're quite keen to get your preferences in mind, so specialties and locations and things like that, and try and achieve whatever contract is best for you based on your timescale. So the good thing about long-term locum is it's extremely good pay. Sometimes it may not necessarily be a specialty you're interested in. Sometimes the hours can be quite bad in terms of when you're paid best. And occasionally you can end up in quite far out locations. So one of my friends this year is doing a long-term locum in Gibraltar, which is a bit of a strange place to go, but he seems to be having a good time. So we've got a brief video by Holt Doctors specifically designed for this event to give you an idea of how they can help. So I'm just going to play that now.
Hi, my name is Megan, and I would like to say a warm welcome to all of those joining the How to Plan Your Perfect F3 Year from Holt Doctors. We're a specialist medical recruitment agency dedicated to doctors, and we are delighted to be sponsoring today's webinar from Make a Medic. Over the years, we've helped thousands of doctors to take an F3 year, and we've seen this route become increasingly popular. Perhaps you're looking to earn extra money, gain clinical experience, understand what it's like to work for a specific trust, or just to take time out for a work-life balance. An F3 year can help with all of these aspirations, giving you flexibility of work and the opportunity to earn more. But what are my options and how can I plan this, I hear you ask? That's where we are best placed to help you. 2 key things to remember. Firstly, while the August rotation may seem far away, it's never too early to register with Holt. By registering now, you can complete all the necessary compliance checks and be ready to take any opportunity that comes your way. Our experienced recruitment consultants are used to working with doctors who are taking time out and are here to answer any questions and support your year. Secondly, why Holt Doctors? As a framework agency, we work in partnership with the NHS and are dedicated to making a real difference to doctors, medical staffing and patient care. We work with over 90% of NHS Trusts, many of them exclusively, giving you first pick of the best F3 jobs available. We help to place over 300 doctors in their F3 year. At Holt Doctors, we take great pride in our integrity and commitment to our doctors. It's why many doctors stay with us throughout their career, and we're awarded 5 stars on independent review sites. Plus, we have an excellent referral scheme in place, so if you refer a friend who works 30 hours with us, you can earn £250. So if you are considering an F3 year, join the Holt Doctors family. Visit our website, holtdoctors.co.uk, where you can access our handy ultimate guide to your F3 year, or give our team a call on 02 08 099 6943. But for now, enjoy today's webinar and we hope to hear from you soon.
Great. So I really would recommend getting in touch with them if you do think you're going to go through an agency. And I think it especially makes sense to do it now because it means that you might have a little bit more flexibility in terms of where you want to live from August, rather than sort of hurriedly trying to figure things out once you got to F3, which is what I ended up having to do. So if you're interested in doing some locum work and you want to have a reasonable range of options, then Holt Doctors is a really good place to start. Right, so moving on to the other type of F3 that you can have, which I refer to as a variable sort of working schedule, is what I've done this year. I've had a great time, but I know that this isn't necessarily something that's appropriate for everyone. And what I mean by variable is that you sort of just work locum shifts on an ad hoc basis whenever you feel like it. So this can again happen through locum agencies, but it's more likely that you'll do it through a trust bank. So trust bank, in case you're unfamiliar with the term, means that doctors who are already registered at a trust, so wherever you've done F1, F2, can apply to be on the bank. So that just means it's people who have worked in the trust before who are able to come back and do shifts as required. So I did my F2 year, my F1 year at Ealing Hospital, my F2 at Imperial at St Mary's, and I remained on the trust bank for both of those trusts, and this meant that I was able to pick up shifts whenever I needed it. The good thing is it's very, very flexible, so I just pick shifts probably about 2 weeks in advance based on when I feel like working, and the pay is pretty good as well. So the bad side of it is that the availability is a little bit specialty dependent. So I'd say A&E is by far the best thing to locum in because there's always so many shifts going. So across a trust as well, there's usually an ED shift pretty much every day. So ED is really good. I'd say ITU is another one that's pretty decent if you happen to have done it before, just because there aren't that many people that can do ITU shifts. So there's less competition for those shifts. Other than that, you can still get lots of general medical shifts, but it does depend very much on the specialty. One thing that can be concerning for some people is what if there aren't any shifts, and that can happen. It's true, but what I've found is that if you do ED, there's usually enough shifts going for you to be able to make a decent amount of money, even if it means going quite hard at one time of the month and then taking it a bit easy for a couple of weeks. Sometimes you will find that you need to work fairly unsocial hours to be able to get a decent amount of money. Though who knows, after the strike and everything, maybe things may change. But that's what I would describe as being the pros and the cons, and this is what I did. So I'm just going to go into more detail about what I've done with my F3. It's not just for me to go on and on about what I've done, but it's more just because all of these points can make sense when I say them out loud to you guys, but it may not seem that tangible. And I think having some sort of example showing you how many shifts I've done and what I've been able to do with the money from the shifts gives you an idea of how the work-life balance can work. So when I started my F3, I decided that my priorities, sort of in order, are listed there on screen. So I really did want to travel. I hadn't done much traveling at all since before COVID, and there were lots of different parts of the world that I was really keen on exploring. I was also that generation where we lost our medical electives because of COVID, and hence there was this sort of itch that needed to be scratched. I also wanted to spend a reasonable amount of time working on Make a Medic and really developing it into something bigger. So that was definitely on my mind. I obviously wanted to maintain my clinical skills and make sure that I didn't have to sort of relearn everything when I got back to it. And finally, I decided that I wanted to apply for ACCS anesthetics, which I have done this year. So I've just laid out a bit of a timeline just to give you an idea of how much I've worked and what kind of traveling and time off I've done. So in August, we just finished, me and a bunch of my friends, we just finished a fairly busy F2 rota. The first thing we did was go from Land's End to John O'Groats as a fundraiser for Make a Medic. I wasn't cycling, I was just the vehicle support, which I'd argue is an essential role. But we spent 2 weeks just doing that. It was actually a really cool experience to see parts of the UK that I wouldn't have done otherwise. So I only did 2 shifts in August. It's probably enough to just about pay my rent, and then moved on to September. During September, I did quite a few shifts, so 10 in total, which is still quite a lot less than you would be doing if you're on a full-time rota, and that was enough to pay the rent and also make a few savings. October, I did 5 shifts, and then I went to the Maldives on a scuba diving holiday for 8 or 9 days. Then between October and November, applications opened up on Oriel. So it's not something that necessarily takes that much time. You've just got to log in, fill in some basic details, and then just click send. although it is a little bit dependent on which thing you're applying to. For example, ACCS anesthetics, there was literally nothing other than just personal information you had to fill in. Whereas for things like IMT, you'll have to write some sort of personal statement pieces, essentially. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Again, it's not something you need to necessarily drag out. I strongly believe that you'd be able to sit down and answer most of those questions and then only take a few days to iterate through them before submitting it. But it comes up around end of October, start of November. So I got back from Maldives, and basically whilst I was on the way back, my friend I was with in the Maldives convinced me to go to Bali 2 weeks later. And I thought, you know what, it's F3, may as well. So I just did as many shifts as I could in that 2 weeks, which ended up just being 5 shifts, but I think those are all night shifts. And then I went to Bali for about 2.5, 3 weeks. So I came back towards the end of November. All the application stuff had been sent off and finalised by then. And December is quite a lucrative month for locums if you are happy to do it on bank holidays and things like that. So I did 18 shifts in December, partly because I had some debts to pay off from all the travels before, but also to save up for the next holiday. So during December, I did a lot of shifts. I also spent some time preparing for the MSRA, which you can sit, well, this year, the window was between, I think it was the 5th and the 17th of January. So I'd booked flights to Fiji on the 6th, so I literally did the first sitting of the MSRA and then got on a plane to Fiji. So I spent 3 weeks in Fiji, somewhere in Sydney, and then came back and did 2 shifts. And then moving forward, February, I went quite heavy as well. I've done about 15 night shifts. I did 15 night shifts this month, which is a lot, but night shifts are pretty good in terms of making a little bit more money because the pay tends to be quite a bit better. So I've just got a couple of questions I've noticed. I'm just going to quickly answer them. So first of all, someone said, can you do ED locum if you've not had a placement in ED? That's a very good question. Generally, people think no. However, one thing I think you can definitely do is get in touch with the department and explain you've not done an ED locum. And if you are interested, you could explain that you'd like to go as an observer, register with their bank and go as an observer for a couple of shifts just to get to grips with what's going on and then start as a locum. So that's something I would definitely recommend considering because ED really does open up a lot of doors for you. So that's worth considering. Next person said, when you say 10 shifts, that 10 days in September. And yes, it was. So it was 10 days or probably more likely nights. I do quite a lot of nights. And then someone just said, how much do you get paid roughly per hour, night versus day? So night, usually, I work in London, which is known as being not really the best place for locums. But I get about £50 per hour on night shifts. And day shifts, it's quite a bit lower. So it'll be about £39-40 an hour. So that really does add up, and I'm quite fortunate in that I'm pretty good at sleeping. So it means that I can do 4 or 5 night shifts without really bothering me too much. So it is a bit dependent on the person really, because I know there's some people whose circadian rhythms are a bit more resistant and aren't quite so keen on doing several nights, and that's completely fair enough. You've got to look after yourself first. But if nights aren't something that bother you, it's something I would certainly recommend because you can just do a bunch all together. Obviously, that's not, it doesn't feel amazing when you're doing it, but then you can, take a week off, as I'm doing this week. So I've got, basically, we're here at the end of February, 15 shifts I've done thus far. My interview for anesthetics is in 2 days' time on Thursday, and then I'm going to try and do as many locums as I physically can over March, except on the strike days, into April, and then go on a trip to Mozambique and Tanzania for a month. I'll come back, do more locums in May and June, and then go to Argentina as my sort of, final end of F3 trip. So the reason I showed you all of this isn't just to showcase my F3 and make me feel good about myself. It's literally just to show you how much you need to work to be able to do some of these things. So thus far, I'll be totally honest, I have managed to pay for these things just by doing the locums. I've not necessarily had to dip into savings or anything. So it is certainly possible. It's just that you might need to go quite hard at certain points, like I have done in December and February. But just from my experience, when you're working as a locum, you're getting paid more, and you know that you've got something really fun on the horizon that you're saving towards, it honestly makes the work so much more enjoyable. Um, Someone said, can you do any specialty because you aren't specialized yet as an F3? Yeah, so you just locum as an SHO. So when you go on these various bank apps and things, you can set filters which just show you the SHO shifts. So much of the time you can just locum as an SHO in whatever you want to. And realistically, for ward-based stuff, it doesn't really matter which specialty it is. I'd say things like ED, they probably would have expected you to have some experience in ED in the past. Same with ITU, but for most, surgical and medical ward-based stuff, that shouldn't be a problem because all of you would have likely, well, you would definitely have done a medical job and probably a surgical job at some point before. Right, so next big topic that many people may be considering is working in Australia and New Zealand. And there's a lot that can be said about this, but I've tried to distill it into 5 main points that you should consider. So, in terms of how you can actually go about setting this up, you can try and get in contact with hospitals directly, but what I would actually recommend is getting in touch with an agency that specializes in this. So, one of our other sponsors for this event is Head Medical, and they're a company who, for the last, I think, 20 years, have been quite literally doing this year in year out, so arranging for UK doctors to go over to Australia and New Zealand and have the time of their lives. So quite often, I think most of the time, almost all the time, it'll be a 12-month contract, but you can have 4, 6 or 12-month placements within it, and you should have a reasonable degree of flexibility in terms of what you want to do. And a few technical questions. You do get paid, I would say, twice as much as an SHO, and the cost of living is probably roughly the same. So I got some of these stats from Head Medical and also from some friends I know who work there. So they were saying they get paid equivalent of about £4,500 per month. And my friends who live in a 2-bed, 2-bathroom flat in Melbourne, they pay $1,700 to $2,000 per person. So that would be about £1,000 per month. So it's sort of like basically living in London and being paid twice as much as an SHO. So they found that they have a lot more disposable income. They're able to do more with it, like going on holidays. Quite often the work schedule can be quite friendly as well. So I know that there's a hospital, I think in Newcastle, which is north of Sydney, which does like a 1 week off, 1 week on rota, which is really amazing. There are a few sort of costs involved, so you need to be registered with the Aussie Medical Council and something called the AHPRA, whatever that is. And that does incur a bit of a cost, but I mean, given that you're being paid quite a bit more over a year, it's probably worth the investment. So the reason I'd recommend getting in touch with Head Medical is that they know these systems inside out, and they will be able to support you throughout the registration process and getting set up at a hospital wherever you want it to be, and in a job that is of interest to you. So they would be a good place to, just call them, explain what your plans are. Even if they're not particularly solid, you don't know which part of Australia to go to or New Zealand, they'll be able to give some options for you. Someone just messaged saying, any tips or resources you'd recommend for people planning an F3 year with a non-medic partner? That's a very good question. I certainly have some friends who've done an F3 where they've had a non-medic partner and they wanted to obviously do some traveling or whatever with them. I would personally recommend. I mean, the friends that I know who've done this, they've generally preferred to have some sort of goal in mind, usually for the second half of the year. Because the good thing about being a medic, I'd say the best thing about being a medic is that you're able to acutely increase your income if you need to. So, for example, if I decide, I'm going to go to I don't know, Tanzania in 3 weeks' time, I could hypothetically do 10 night shifts between now and then and acutely increase my income. Whereas people who are on, a fixed contract, even if they're being paid a lot more on a monthly basis in something outside medicine, they can't necessarily do that. They need a few months notice to be able to put some money aside for whatever trip they want to do. So I found that most of them tend to do the travels in the second half of the year, and in the first half they may be doing a fellow job, or they may be just locuming quite a bit. Another question: New Zealand, Australia, are you basically a fixed contract locum? Yeah, essentially. So in Australia and New Zealand, there's so many British doctors, so they have these systems in place where I wouldn't even call it locum. I just say it's a bit like a clinical fellow year essentially. So you're on a contract, working on a rota, but they know that it's going to come to an end after a year. Many people choose to extend it though. Someone said many F2s I know started sorting placements blah blah early in F2 year. Can you still organize this later in the year if another alternative work plan doesn't pan out? Yes, absolutely. So I found that there were a few people who really thought ahead, and literally by the start of F2, they seemed to have all these jobs lined up in Adelaide and Sydney and Melbourne and whatnot. But I spoke to Head Medical, who literally do this as their main operations, and they have just so many contacts, and that is just a good place to start. So it doesn't. So they said this is actually a really good time to get things underway because you've got 6 months until August. That's plenty of time to get your paperwork in place, find a job, and quite often they don't actually start until maybe around October time. So you'll have a couple of months to get your stuff sorted as well. Wrap up wherever you may be working or living right now. Take some time off and then head off to Australia in October. So that's something that many of my friends did, and they're having an absolute blast over there at the moment. So I wouldn't worry if you haven't had a chance to organise anything in Australia and New Zealand so far, but I would strongly, strongly recommend getting in touch with Head Medical as soon as possible to get things underway. And someone said, do you find it challenging working as a locum, adapting to different hospital environments, people? So I'd say no, because I work as a locum in the place where I have done my F2 jobs. So I work in ED at St Mary's. I did my F2 job there, and I know that department extremely well. So that makes it quite easy. And I'd say ED is probably the easiest thing to locum in the sense that you don't need to, learn the patients on the ward. You literally just turn up, you see new patients, you sort them out, and then you go home. Whereas sometimes if you're doing locums on a ward, it can take a bit of time to know which patients are where, what's going on with them, and that's a little bit more difficult to get your head around. I have locumed in places where I haven't worked before, so for example in ED at Charing Cross, or in ITU at places like St Mary's or Charing Cross where I haven't specifically worked. But quite often, I mean, if you have an understanding of the specialty that you're in, you're able to get to grips with the systems and the people quite quickly without too much issue. So much of the time, I found that people are just glad that you're there, that you've covered the shift. So it can be a bit challenging. I won't lie to you. It is a little bit nerve-wracking when you turn up to a new department and you don't know where anything is. But it doesn't take long to get to grips with things and figure out where things are. So I can see there's one more question, but I'm just gonna go through the last bit of this before moving on. So again, it sounds like it from the comments that so many of you are considering going to Australia and New Zealand. It doesn't matter if you've done absolutely nothing towards it so far, but please do get in touch with Sharon at Head Medical ASAP just to get the ball rolling, because there will be some certificates and various things that you need to dig up from the bottom of your desktop, and that can take a little bit of time. But if you can get these all sent off and let these guys deal with it, then you can hopefully get an amazing job set up for August or October or whenever you want. Right, so last slide, I'm just going to briefly go through the professional considerations as well. So, of course, you want to have an amazing F3 year, but if you're considering applying for specialty training for the following cycle, then there's a few things that you should bear in mind. So many people spend F3 or spend a part of F3 getting some of the postgrad exams done. So things like MRCP and MRCS, you can get done just because you have a bit more time to revise. And hence it's worth getting those done if it's on your mind. So November is when October, November is when the applications open on Oriel. So you will probably need a few days around then to go through, sort out all your various bits and pieces, and send off the application. January is the MSRA, so that applies to almost every specialty now except IMT. That is constantly changing. So it may be the case that MSRA is becoming sort of like the postgrad UK CAT, where everyone needs to do it to enter specialty training. So start of January, so this year was 5th to the 17th, was the window during which you can sit it. And the thing about MSRA is that you need to sit it in a Pearson View Centre. So unless they change it between now and next year, it is something where, I mean, ideally you'd want to be in in the UK, or you should be able to do it from some other countries as well. But if you're planning to be abroad, you will need to think ahead and plan ahead. So I know some friends who've done it from Brazil and Australia and places like that. So it is possible. It just requires a little bit more thinking. And then February, March time is when interviews are. And those interviews, on the whole, as far as I'm aware, all of them will be online. So you can technically do it from anywhere. One of my friends just did an interview from New Zealand. And finally, portfolio wise, there'll be lots of teaching leadership QI stuff that you may be thinking of doing in the F3 year, just to bolster your portfolio and make you a more sort of robust candidate for all of these specialty training programs. If that is something you're interested in and you like the work that Make a Medic do, then please do subscribe to our monthly newsletter. We keep it simple and keep it quite concise, but there are plenty of opportunities coming up in the future to do things like teaching leadership, QI, etc. With us. So I would recommend scanning the QR code and subscribing. And if you have any more questions at this point, please do let me know. I'm just going to quickly whittle through the ones that I've missed. Someone said, can you stay in Australia after your F3 and start your training there? And then will this training be recognised in the UK? Can you move back? Can you move back halfway and complete training in the UK? So I'm going to be honest with you. I actually have absolutely no idea. But I imagine it will be pretty tricky to sort of switch training halfway through. It probably isn't going to be that much of an issue entering training in Australia if you're registered with the Australian Medical Council, but I think it's unlikely for you to be able to do some of it there and then move over. But again, please do look that up yourself because I have no idea specifically. And again, don't have a clue about Dubai. What do you think is the best way of using F3 to recover from burnout? So I think that'll be a very personal question, to be honest, because I think burnout means different things to different people. I certainly think just giving yourself a moment to think, what do you really want to do? Because I think burnout happens when your life is being so dominated by something that you're not getting much satisfaction from, that it sort of means that it's probably been a fair time since you did things that you really enjoyed. So yeah, so it can vary. So some people may say, you know what, just go traveling straight away, but others may find that quite stressful, because traveling isn't easy either. It does require quite a bit of planning. It means that you're away from home and all sorts of other things. So I really would recommend just having a good think about what exactly it is that has made you feel burnt out and how you personally think you could recover from it. But F3 is the perfect opportunity to do so. If you're feeling burnt out, one thing I would say though is it's probably best not to get involved in a sort of like a heavy rota based job like a clinical fellow job. It's probably better to give yourself a few months just to have a breather and just get yourself back on track, and then perhaps further down the line you can apply for whatever you want to apply to. Oh yeah, one other thing to bear in mind is that fellow jobs do kind of pop up here and there, so there are times when they're more likely to arise. So usually at sort of 4 monthly and 6 monthly junctions. But sometimes people start fellow jobs and then leave them, in which case you do get these openings. Did you keep a e-portfolio? So yeah, my trust has this sort of Horus equivalent, which they made available to anyone who wanted it. And I have, well, I've signed up for it. I haven't filled it in much detail at the moment. But it probably is worthwhile, just putting some reflections and things in just to keep it ticking, just so you can say that you have done so. Do you have to arrange an appraisal during F3? So yeah, you do, and that's actually much easier said than done. So if you're working anywhere during your F3 year, there should be someone who's familiar with the system. It just needs to be a consultant that you're working under. You can just say, can you give me sort of 10 minutes of your time to go through a couple of portfolio things and sign it off. So it's not something I've done yet, but it seems easy enough to do. Someone said, do you have any advice for working in another less common country than Australia, e.g. India? Do agencies work there? Do you have to apply to individual hospitals? That's a good question. So it depends if you're talking about sort of like humanitarian work, or whether you're talking about actually working in a hospital. I honestly don't know anything about working in places other than Australia and New Zealand. I imagine there probably are agencies that help arrange that, but I think it may make more sense. Oh, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how you go about it at all, really. I would just Google it because I'm sure there are agencies, but I'm not sure the infrastructure is so great for some of these countries. I mean, for Australia and New Zealand, there's basically a highway between the UK and Australia and New Zealand for doctors to go down. But for most other places, I can imagine there's a lot of red tape, there's visas and registration and all sorts that take some time to get done. And some people are interested in doing sort of humanitarian work with MSF and people like that. Um, I would say that that may be possible, but on the whole, those agencies tend to prefer taking people who are a bit more skilled, so people who are at the very least registrars. Um, so that's one thing to bear in mind as well. So Georgina said, "Did you ever feel de-skilled coming back to clinical practice after a month or so traveling?" To be honest, not really. I think it takes quite a lot to get de-skilled. People are quite worried about that. And of course, it can feel a little bit weird sometimes where, you're just thinking to yourself, I've not held a cannula in 3 months. But it really doesn't take long for things to start coming back. I mean, you've spent the best part of 8 or 9 years learning all of these things. Taking 3 months or 6 months or a year out isn't going to do that much damage. Can you do F2 in Australia instead of F3? I'm not 100% sure I understand that question. I'm going to assume that you're a current F1 if you're asking that question. As far as I'm aware, I don't think so. I've never heard of such a thing. No, I'm pretty certain you'll have to do F1 and F2 in the UK if you're already in a foundation program. But who knows? Maybe things will change. Um, what has been the experience of any of your peers who've returned after an F3? So the way I'd put it is that I've never met anyone who's regretted doing an F3. I've met plenty of people who've regretted not doing an F3. Because also, if you think about it, the next step is a fairly big chunk as well. For example, I'm applying for ACCS anesthetics training, and that's going to be 4 years of my life, which I'm sort of pinned down to. Um, Whereas this F3, if I did that immediately after F1, F2, I really don't know how I would have tolerated that because that means that I would have spent, my years from the age of 24 to 30 just on a full time contract with on calls and things like that. So I've absolutely loved doing an F3. It's been the best thing I ever did, and many people who've done an F3 will say the same. So it's a wonderful opportunity. If you're even half considering it, just do it. Any other questions? Right, if there's no other questions, I think I'm going to call it a day. Thank you for attending this event, and if you have any more questions, then please do feel free to get in touch by via LinkedIn or by emailing me. But nonetheless, good luck with the rest of your foundation program, and if you do choose to do an F3, I hope you have a great time. Last question, someone said, why do you think F3 is growing year on year? I just think it's become more and more sort of acceptable, really, because initially people who did F3s were viewed as almost sort of as if they were going off the rails, just because of convention. Whereas now it's viewed as being an amazing opportunity for you to do something incredible. So I think the fact that it's more accepted and it clearly doesn't affect people's career progression, there's literally no reason not to do it, basically. So that would be my answer to that. Anyway, thank you so much for coming, and good luck.